In our discussion today, we're going to consider these questions about the ethics of war in the 21st century. In this age of drones, cyber attacks, and increasingly autonomous weapons, how do we ensure that war in all its forms is conducted ethically? Is it even possible to uphold traditional military values of courage, honor, and accountability in a digital battlefield? And what old and new frameworks or guidelines might we need to navigate these uncharted waters? First, let's consider that over the past 120 years or so, we've gone from essentially hand-to-hand combat to scenarios where soldiers can launch attacks from thousands of miles away. Of course, close-quarters combat still takes place today, as we've seen in the Ukraine and Gaza conflicts. But more and more, drone warfare seems to be a game-changer, probably even more than aircraft-changed warfare in the first half of the 20th century. One reason for this is because many military planners view drone missions as practically risk-free for the personnel involved. After all, if the attacker is sitting in a secure control room thousands of miles away, a counterstrike is very unlikely. But without the attacker's life at risk, are the stakes somehow different? Does that change the ethical equation? Traditionally speaking, a military leader was expected to share in the hardships and risks faced by their troops. So, how does that concept of shared risk and sacrifice apply to a drone operator and their commander sitting in a control room on a different continent where they can go to a comfy home at the end of the day? Is this disconnect between action and consequence eroding the very foundations of traditional military values? If physical risk and shared sacrifice aren't part of the equation anymore, if conflict is reduced to essentially a video game, what should define a soldier's courage or honor? And if those values are shifting, is it changing the nature of the military itself? Perhaps we're seeing these changes in action. Some have called it the corporatization of the military, a more bureaucratic approach, pointing to a growing emphasis on efficiency and results at the potential expense of the traditions that once defined military service. What we may be seeing is a shift from traditional values, such as those that are taught in boot camps, to the disconnected values of first-person shooter video gaming. For example, FPS games often prioritize individual achievement. Players are encouraged to dominate the scoreboard, sometimes even at the expense of team objectives. In contrast, traditional military values stress teamwork, unit cohesion, and the subordination of individual goals for the sake of the mission. Therefore, success relies on coordinated action and mutual support, perhaps even personal sacrifice. In video games, violence is often portrayed as the primary solution to every problem, often casual and consequence-free, with respawns minimizing the gravity of lethal force. Traditionally, the military emphasizes rules of engagement and discipline. Breaches of these values are often, but not always, met with severe consequences. Video games typically treat enemies as faceless, disposable targets, encouraging a dehumanizing perspective. While the brutality of real-life warfare often requires some reduction in common human feelings like compassion, the psychological effects of this experience can linger on for years. This disconnect between video game values and military values raises concerns about the potential impact of gamification on perceptions of warfare, especially when applied to drone warfare, thus raising questions about the psychological impact on those fighting these modern wars. Some former drone operators have experienced significant emotional and moral struggles after their service, while others, perhaps most, have not. Will the detachment inherent in drone warfare create a disconnect from the consequences of one's actions? Or will old military afflictions like PTSD still affect modern warfighters? Will this emotional distance from the battlefield lead to a kind of desensitization to extreme violence? Will this in turn cause serious ramifications for individuals and societies as a whole? Will it be possible that over-reliance on drone warfare could make military and civilian leaders accustomed to risk-free combat leading to either increased interventionism in low-risk scenarios or quickly resorting to nuclear weapons when facing a technologically advanced enemy. Questions like these make you wonder if there's a way to reconcile these new forms of warfare with the ethical frameworks that have guided us for centuries. That's where just war theory comes in, something I've discussed in several previous videos. To recap, just war theory is a set of principles that have been debated for centuries, going back to figures like St. Augustine. Essentially, it lays out criteria for when it's morally acceptable to go to war in the first place, in Latin jus ad bellum, and how to conduct a war ethically, in Latin jus in bello. Jus ad bellum includes principles like just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, last resort, and reasonable prospect of success. Jus in bello emphasizes principles like distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants and proportionality, using only the force necessary to achieve military objectives. But the challenge is in how to apply these classic principles to modern conflicts. As I mentioned earlier, drone warfare eliminates the shared vulnerability on the battlefield, since the operator is often thousands of miles away, completely removed from any personal danger, thus creating an imbalance of risk. Some have argued that this could proceed to a situation where leaders, who might not be considered psychologically, mentally, or morally fit for traditional combat, would be initiating warfare without regard to any ethical considerations. St. Augustine warned of the deeper moral dangers that can arise within warfare, things like the love of violence, revengeful cruelty, and the lust for power, those evil impulses that can turn war into something truly monstrous. And it seems like those very evils could be amplified by the detached nature of modern warfare. After all, if you're not facing your enemy face to face, if you're just looking at a screen, it's easier to dehumanize them, to forget that there are real people on the other side of those pixels. So, can the technology make it easier to fall prey to those darker impulses? Does the emotional distance built into drone warfare and cyber attacks create a slippery slope towards the evils Augustine warned against, creating, as some have put it, corrupt cowards? As I see it, in a world increasingly reliant on technology for warfare, we need to be constantly questioning and reevaluating how our ethical principles apply to the changing realities of conflict. As technology keeps advancing, we will certainly see even more ethical dilemmas arising, raising a whole new set of questions about accountability and the very nature of warfare. We need to be thinking ahead, anticipating the challenges that these technologies will bring. So let's next consider some of the challenges that these technological military wonders bring about. As I touched on, the physical remoteness of drone operators can lead to a psychological detachment from the consequences of their actions, potentially lowering the threshold for resorting to lethal force. Furthermore, ensuring proportionality and minimizing civilian casualties in drone strikes remains a significant challenge, particularly in densely populated areas. Some military and intelligence policy planners have suggested implementing rigorous procedures to confirm the identity of the target and ensure that it is a legitimate military objective, as well as using techniques such as pattern of life analysis to minimize the possibility of civilian casualties. Of course, this depends on having well-oiled and honest intelligence gathering operations, something that is very challenging in and of itself. Cyber warfare, from infecting enemy computers with malware to exploding beepers, represents a new frontier in conflict, blurring the lines between traditional notions of war and peace. Defining what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace is quite ambiguous. Attributing attacks to specific actors can be difficult, and the potential for unintended consequences is substantial. Cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure, such as power grids or healthcare systems, can have devastating humanitarian consequences, raising serious ethical concerns about proportionality and discrimination of military versus civilian targets. This requires clear definitions of what constitutes a military objective in cyberspace, which can be challenging given the dual-use nature of much of the infrastructure. Military policy experts also caution that the indiscriminate effects from some cyber war techniques could propagate uncontrollably and cause unintended damage to civilians. Similar to drone warfare, robust intelligence operations will be essential, although we can count on transparency and public reporting to be ongoing issues. Speaking of intelligence operations, the manipulation of information and the spread of disinformation have become powerful tools of modern warfare. Propaganda, fake news, and social media manipulation can be used to influence public opinion, undermine trust in institutions, and even incite violence. Given how information warfare and intelligence operations have worked throughout history, I don't think we'll see any ethical changes in this area. To move closer to the realm of science fiction, we should next consider autonomous weapons systems, aka killer robots, which pose a fundamental challenge to the just war tradition. It's obvious that delegating life or death decisions to machines raises concerns about accountability, proportionality, the potential for unintended damage and escalation, and terrible unintended consequences. Military experts warn that these systems should never be deployed without a meaningful level of human control, particularly in critical functions like target selection and engagement. They insist that for these systems to be anywhere near ethical, there must be a human in the loop to authorize lethal action, with the fail-safe ability to override or shut down the system if necessary. I feel we've raised more questions than answers as we look into how we might apply the just war framework in the 21st century. War has always been ethically complex, and changes in technology and evolving geopolitical realities have always played a part. We also know that us humans aren't going to give up war as a means to continue politics, as Clausewitz put it. Even so, the just war tradition, while rooted in historical context, still remains a vital tool for navigating the ethical complexities of 21st century warfare. Some international policy experts believe that this framework can be extended by agreements similar to the Geneva Convention to ensure transparency, accountability, proportionality, and protection of civilian populations. Agreements would also need to be reached to clarify the legal combatant status of drone operators and cyber warfare specialists who function outside of the standard battlefield. When it comes to fully autonomous weapons, many believe that a complete ban on these weapons is needed, arguing that they inherently violate the principles of distinction and proportionality. Others have proposed a more nuanced approach, thinking that by focusing on regulation and ensuring human oversight, similar to how other weapons of mass destruction are managed. As we can see from our discussion, the ethics of war in the 21st century continue to demand careful scrutiny, and the just war tradition still provides us with a valuable framework for navigating these complex ethical dilemmas. By applying these classic principles to contemporary challenges like drone warfare, cyber attacks, and beyond, we can strive for a more just and ethical approach to the use of force. And maybe one day we will realize that we're fools to make war on our brothers in arms. What do you think? Do the classical ethics of war still hold up in the 21st century, or are they mostly outdated? What do you think about the gamification of warfare? Do you think autonomous weaponry is an existential risk for humanity, as science fiction suggests? Let me hear what you think in the comments. Your participation is always appreciated.